This is the point in the podcast series where I disclose some of the inside baseball of academia, in specific the ethical and bias considerations that one might have when one is attempting to observe anything, literally anything. So in this case, despite concerted attempts to stay objective, the coding of the data required me to interpret results, and that's when you bring to bear everything you know and you make an interpretation. In this undertaking of coding data, any data of any kind, some subjectivity in decision-making is required. And I worked really hard to find documentary proof of the board game designer's racial and gender identification, but in some instances this required a significant amount of internet research. Some designers had a very limited footprint online, and regarding the cover art analysis, I resisted letting my previous knowledge of a game influence my coding decisions. For example, with Sekigahara, The Unification of Japan, the 2011 game, I coded 175 artwork figures as gender and race undetermined, despite the reasonable assumption that the figures on the battlefield depicted might be understood to be male and Japanese. But you couldn't be certain of that. And in this case, it's actually a painting. Figures were too stylized, too small to make definitive judgments, and we all know from reading any amount of history that not all warriors are men, right? In making such decisions, I tried to imagine how a consumer with no knowledge of the game would read the artwork on the covers. To determine if my coding assessments were accurate and objective, I conducted a coding verification step based on the model that was given to all of us by Williams, Martin, Consalvo, and Ivory in that 2009 terrific study that they conducted, as well as the Annenberg movie and television studies. I paid 2 coders to replicate a cross-section of my coding, each taking 20 random board game covers, and 20 different designers to code. Each volunteer coder was trained in advance, provided the materials, and given clear directions on the coding categories to ensure there was no definitional drift, as it's called in academia, or differing understanding of what's meant by white, male, female, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, person of color, non-binary, etc. In this process, I found the coder's findings, and my results had a Cohen's kappa percentage of 0.97, which is really high. Cohen's kappa is a statistical coefficient that represents the degree of accuracy of the findings between qualitative coders, each of them making, judgment calls, and with a 0.81 or 1 finding considered to be a near perfect level of agreement. So 0.97 is perfect, near perfect. Level of agreement. And that means that we both had the same conclusions, and we were very, very different people. This verification process helped to demonstrate the accuracy of my findings and ensure readers can have a strong confidence in my coding process. So first, given my data sources and my methods of data collection, I had to assume that the information board game designers were sharing about themselves online was accurate. And further, I had to assume, through a process of my own verification, that the wider information about the top 400 BGG ranked games was accurate in each of the 400 respective entries. With crowdsourced, open, user-driven fan portals, there is a chance that some of the information might be outdated or incorrect. I did in fact note errors and omissions in some of the board game listings, which I simply corrected in my own database. In some cases, when I did not have access to the actual game boxes themselves, I needed to rely on images of the game posted to BGG. Thus, if any errors were made in the original data and the images posted to BGG, that old adage of data mining and analysis might apply. Garbage in, garbage out. Overall, though, I acknowledge that the data that I was using from BGG to make coding decisions might be incomplete, and that's a really important admission. And this is something everyone should do, because I actually spent a year attempting to be a radical skeptic and mistrusting everything. It was quite a difficult year. And so in this case, working from some assumptions, we all have to do it every single day, and I was making sure that I was verifying things in a bunch of different ways to get the highest degree of accuracy with my conclusions. But again, we are limited by the resources we have available to us as data coders, as analysts, as observers of the world. And some of my field observations required that I make a qualitative call about how each board game designer identified themselves in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, using outside sources to validate those decisions. Each decision was grounded in significant investigation into each listed game designer. So I did a lot of due diligence because, again, that year of being a radical skeptic really helps me to make sure I make data-driven decisions as much as I always possibly can. Some might argue that that sample of 400 board games for a game designer analysis and that top 200 games for the artwork analysis were too small to be representative samples via which we can observe and infer wider patterns about the hobby board game industry. As such, my research might be challenged by sample representation issues with a small sample, however defined, and the higher potential for deviancy or being fully unrepresentative of the wider population of board games. Overall, quantitative assessments are by their very nature limited. We cannot observe everything in the world. We can't possibly do that. There are simply bottom line numbers that have to be contextualized with additional qualitative data. And that's why I made this a mixed methods process. Taken alone, quantitative analysis don't really tell the entire story. And sometimes, there are very infamous examples of this, using quantitative analysis, you don't actually make the correct interpretation. So you need that qualitative layer to really contextualize what the numbers are telling you. And this was the rationale for blending work with, again, other research measures, such as the survey and the qualitative interviews. And that final important point about the delimitations at issues is the selection of BGG as a structured data set in the first place. The question I often get is, why not look at mass market games and/or raw sales or revenue numbers for mass market games instead? And first, I needed a structured data source that gave me insight into the current state of the hobby praxis, as academics like to call it, but it's just playing games, the practice of playing games. BGG consistently ranks in the top 4 for tabletop games and offers a unique crowdsourced view into hobbyist perspectives. When designing the study, I had to look at my own independent, unfunded capacity to study this expansive hobby and sector. And having conducted large-scale mass market research with the backing of corporate clients, I understood that the scope and scale of investigating mass market household behaviors was too big. I would not be able to obtain a clear picture of mass market games with any degree of certainty or accuracy. And given my own limited resources, I'm just one broke student when I was doing this, a focus on BGG with all of its imperfections stated throughout this entire research project was my best choice to obtain a snapshot of hobby games in the community. BGG, like other websites, demonstrate that 1% rule of internet culture, that precipitation, inequality rule, which is that only 1% of a given community actually writes down things, posts things, etc. And it asserts that only 1% of active users dominate a website's content and its discourses. So that rule further states that other users, that remaining 99%, might take a more passive, lurking role on the site. This 1% rule tells us that BGG, like any other internet site, is shaped and skewed by active users, which only represent that very tiny percentage of the user community. They curate a space that privileges their worldviews, preferences, and objectives. And it should be clearly understood that this research does not purport to address the entirety of the board game hobby nor the sector itself. It's a snapshot of a segment of board gaming. And we're going to go into this in more detail, looking at how segments, sections, permutations of board games and board gaming community can diverge quite a bit. Now to the survey. The online survey I conducted was designed to gather perspectives and experiences from women, non-binary, Black, Indigenous persons of color, and LGBTQ+ members of the hobby who are 19 years of age or older. And the promotional materials I pulled together to promote this survey really included that inclusion criteria. So the quantitative online survey was designed and launched using Google Forms. It was promoted to active members of the board game community from August to October in 2020. I was able to ensure that I got respondents that matched that inclusion criteria, although nobody was excluded. Okay, I targeted promotions of the survey on forums, specifically targeting online game players and industry professionals. This included Board Game Geek Women in Gaming, which was a great discussion group. Rainbow BGG, similarly amazing. the regional specific BGG fora in Alberta, BC, Ontario, Yukon, Alberta, said it Alberta twice there, Manitoba, Quebec, PEI, and Nova Scotia. I also posted the survey links to what was then Twitter, now X, and to the Reddit forum called Sample Size, a discussion board focused on market research surveys, as well as our board games. But I received a really limited engagement from mostly the Reddit platform. Most of my traction actually occurred on BGG and Twitter. The survey questions were informed and influenced by a variety of sources, and questions about duration of time with a hobby, levels of engagement were informed by something called the Modified Engagement Scale, or UES, which is used a lot in tech. Used in human-computer interaction studies, the traditional user engagement scale, which is UES, again, is an assessment tool developed to measure user engagement. And it's used to test video games and simulations. I really like it. I've used it professionally in my work in tech and thought it had some really good elements of gauging people's relative, enjoyment, engagement with a particular game. The original tool of UES consists of 31 items that focus on dimensions like engagement, aesthetic appeal, focused attention, novelty, perceived usability, felt involvement, how did you feel involved in the game, and endurability. So a modification of the engagement scale developed by O'Brien et al. In 2018 attempts to provide a consistent and short, usable, and long-form version for use in media analyst projects, and is called the User Engagement Scale Longform, which is UES-LF. I didn't use these scales themselves, but reading them provided some catalyst for framing levels of engagement with a hobby, in this case board gaming. And I used some ideas from several assessment scales from elements of Reeves and Reed, which is 2009. I assessed the relative level of commitment to the gaming hobby in terms of weekly, monthly, and yearly frequency of gameplay. There was this great David study in 2013, which used extensive in-person interviews to create a complex picture of how women engage with digital and analog games. There's a Davis study again that placed that emphasis on intersections of relationship status, childcare, work responsibilities, and other competing activities, participants' ability to engage in gaming. And that Davis study really explored how representation impacted gaming behaviors and delved into questions as to whether gaming was male-dominated in terms of respondents' perceptions of the hobby. So using all of these sources for inspiration, the study was created based on that reading and research, and it was segmented into key sections that touched on key categories of questions for respondents, which included gaming habits, access to gaming spaces, participation in gaming, discrimination and representation in gaming, as well as a final section asking for demographic information from the respondents. The questions and their answers will be explored in greater detail in later podcasts. And I'll also provide you with a quick overview of what is in that survey in a later podcast. And so that was the creation of my survey. And for the majority of the questionnaire, I opted for questions based on the Likert scale, which is out of 5. And it's usually, you've seen this one before. If you've ever done a marketing research study, it's got strongly agree, neutral, which is I don't know, disagree, and strongly agree available to respondents. And people are asked to gauge their level of agreement or disagreement with a statement. Many of the questions were about assessing thoughts and feelings and other qualitative personal perspectives, and that Likert scale is widely used as a psychometric measure that helps researchers gauge participant opinions about their relative level of intensity of feeling. It can help gauge feelings of motivation, anxiety, and self-confidence, that's a quote, in a way that large numbers of respondents can answer quickly in a format that is widely used by market research studies. Again, it's super familiar to most of us who have ever taken a survey. And the Likert scale can be used to measure and inform other qualitative measures such as in-person or online interviews. The survey was a really lengthy one, though. It had 127 questions, and I believe the Likert scale was a more efficient means of getting a large volume of responses from a large number of people versus that written response type question. Like all good academics, we all have to catalog everything. So here's the process I undertook to invite people to complete the online survey, because this is really important to show and demonstrate that I cast the net really wide. Participants were invited to complete the online survey. I asked participants whether they were a member of the board game hobby, a casual player, game collector, industry member, content creator, designer, etc. My justification for the focus of Black, Indigenous, persons of color, women, and LGBTQ+ gamers was that these populations were consistently understudied, and they were marginalized in the board gaming space. And as I demonstrated in an earlier podcast, looking at some of the stats around user census kind of activities within board gaming, I realized they were super unrepresented in those surveys. So I really wanted to work very, very hard to locate those gamers to bring them into my survey. And that was important to the research and the anonymity of the participants, that they need not contact me directly in any way. I wanted it to be completely anonymous. This step was undertaken to ensure participants felt safe and were free to share their honest perspectives about the board game hobby and industry. When the survey was concluded, although it came a little under my prior expectation for responses, I had about 320 unique participants. It was a uniquely busy time in human history, so I'm quite pleased overall with how many participants I got. And it was a very long survey, so I was very, very pleasantly surprised to see that so many people completed it and even wrote a lot of detail in the survey. But I wanted to thank everyone for their time, so I did conduct a drawing for a $100 gift card for an online board game warehouse. And only those participants who told me that they were interested in drawing for that $100 gift card had to participate. Their contact information for that drawing, which I did not look at, did not use in any other capacity, was woven into a Google form, which was basically a random number generator survey drawing form that I created myself using best practices. And they were completely disconnected from their survey responses. So I didn't know who anyone was. I didn't know how they responded. And that was super important to me as well, that everyone felt and knew that I was taking unbelievable precautions never to know the identity of any of the respondents to my survey. And in this way, the email addresses were disconnected from those responses. When gender identity, racial, ethnicity, age ranges, sexual orientation, relationship status, board gaming habits in the online survey was requested, no other personally identified information such as names, addresses, phone numbers, emails were requested. And again, that's super important to me, so people knew that they were just completely anonymous or confidential to me. And that email list was destroyed immediately after the drawing. The gift card recipient was randomly drawn again, and they were contacted to let them know that they won that gift card, but there was no interaction other than that, and no discussion between us, and I didn't know how they responded in the survey whatsoever. This online survey was super lengthy, just like I shared, and required at least 35 to 40 minutes to complete, and there was rightly testing feedback that I received prior to the survey launch that the survey link might pose a problem for people who are busy with work, school, or family lives. That's a big problem in market research, right? Most of us are just running flat out all day, every day. And that can be a real problem because a lot of people don't get hit by marketing surveys and don't get represented in the marketplace as a result. So it should be understood by the listener that these participants who took the time to fill out that survey length had that privilege of 35 or 40 minutes of dedicated time during their day, which is a privilege not afforded to most of us. Gig economy jobs, employment precarity, there was record unemployment, still is, and all of these challenges of life during that early global COVID pandemic made that survey tough to fill out. Further, all the respondents were given an opportunity to write long-form answers to respond to the question, are there any other thoughts you'd like to share about your experiences in board gaming? And I was really surprised by the level of engagement from the respondents, the generosity with both their time and the depth of their responses. It was amazing to see how many respondents took the time to seriously engage with the questions and even provide lengthy comments and thoughtful responses to the multiple choice Likert scale. Some of them were genuinely moving, and I've woven them as much as possible into all of my research because these stories deserve to be told. And this question alone generated that open-ended question, a rich trove of qualitative perspectives that I combined with the quantitative findings to add additional clarification and color. And those overall results demonstrated that diversity of responses and respondents who were a mixture of identities and backgrounds from all around the world. And I'm really excited to share those with you in subsequent podcasts. The promotional strategy of posting this survey to several different places, and this is a really important tip for anyone who wants to do survey research. I knew this from my past in-market research, that you want to do multiple versions of this Google form across as many forums as you possibly can. There's a reason for this, because you don't want you want to be able to monitor all of the forms, and you also want to make sure that nobody is filling it out multiple times. This can happen. So I had a lot of stopgaps and risk mitigation strategies to prepare for that. And it turned out that early preparedness was very prescient, because I did have some attempts post the publication of some of my research. Individuals came forward and said they had tried to hack my survey, and I will share with you how that was impossible. So these precautions were taken in light of some online harassment and threats I received after the publication of my 2018 analysis on board game designers and their artwork in the top 200 and top 100 games. And so this new research initiative, I had a lot of intelligence about what might be attempted to be said after the publication of my information. And I knew that there was a really large, or maybe not so large community, but a very vocal and loud community that really dislikes this kind of research endeavor. So my strategy was designed to mitigate the impact of any online backlash, hacking attempts, or other malicious activity. I posted multiple copies of my survey across multiple forums and was able to track and monitor any attempts to engage in what's called griefing or trollish behaviors, such as attempts to repeatedly complete the survey or entering gibberish or offensive responses. I was prepared for that. And in the design of my Google Forms survey, I also ensured the survey could be only completed once by a participant, one email per, and multiple attempts would be blocked, as Google Forms was based on a participant's email address, and any subsequent attempt was blocked. And hourly monitoring through the months of August to October 2020, I looked at those surveys, I monitored the responses, and I observed no attempts to troll the surveys, nor any attempt or effort to fill the completed surveys with nonsense, offensive content, or threats. This is in the days before ChatGPT. There was a lot of variability. Most people wrote in very, very detailed stories. There was incredibly good geographic distribution. And that trollish behavior that I was worried about did not crop up, did not occur. And I present those findings in some of my online conference presentations. I did have one very persistent troll who habitually, systematically trolled anyone who was a woman, who was visible in the board game community. He made claims that he had attempted to grief my survey. He got key data wrong in his public assertions. And again, looking at the back end of all of my analytics, there was no attempt to do that. There was no unusual behavior, no duplicate surveys were submitted, etc. So this is a really important precaution for folks who are thinking about doing online surveys, particularly if you're a woman in board game, or rather game studies whatsoever. You will be dogged with harassment and threats. This is just part of the process, part of the gig, unfortunately. And you have to take a lot of really, really careful steps, because there are many out there in the world who want to subvert, to drive us out of the public square and not have us discuss important issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So this is kind of the checkpoint of the podcast series where I lay bare some of the ethics and bias considerations that one should always undertake, plan for. As you're doing this kind of research, you're subject to a lot of scrutiny, especially if you're a woman in board game critical analysis. And you really do need to make sure that you're doing, double, triple, quadruple the amount of work to make assertions in this community, because you are subject to a lot of scrutiny. And I really took that to heart and made sure that I had really redoubled all of my efforts in terms of risk mitigation, rigor, making sure that there was no reasonable accusation of subjectivity or bias. As I was doing this work, hiring people who were actually openly antagonistic to this research was actually part of that. And that is the kind of scrutiny that women in the board game community are subjected to, that are subjected to in game studies and analysis. And it is something, unfortunately, we have to really take care to recognize and plan for, because I was dogged throughout this process of research and afterwards by, I guess the best way to describe it is trolls, persistent trolls, stalkers, who really, really wanted to do everything they could to subvert and undercut my credibility, the credibility of others who do this kind of work. And it really does create a situation where many folks in board game content creation, in the industry and in the critical analysis of this important sector can get quite tired. On that note, there's been a bit of a break between my episodes in this podcast series. Unfortunately, I had a very, very significant issue with the tool that I was using to create some of these. And actually I'm still having some of those issues. It's really, really tough to pull this work together on a shoestring budget like I have. I'm doing this all myself, and no excuses, however, but I did have some really, really persistent challenges with just gear. I also had a death in the family. So again, apologies for the break between these podcast episodes. We've been dealing with a lot. I know you probably are too. It's a just really, really tough and difficult time in human history to be alive. And so with that, I thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate those who are listening to this podcast series. It means a lot to me. Thank you so much. If you like this podcast, click the like button, share it with a friend. It means the world to me, and I hope you have a great day.